Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before proceeding further, my fellow Republicans on this committee and we sent you a letter over 2 months ago calling for an oversight hearing on the $2 trillion of so-called COVID-19 relief, the legislation that was signed into law in March of 2021. In our letter, Mr. Chairman, we highlighted numerous examples of waste and mismanagement of that funding, including millions of dollars spent to build parking lots in South Carolina, millions to plant trees in New York, build golf courses in Florida, and it even sent Japanese citizens living in Japan and convicted prisoners $1,400 stimulus checks, not to mention the billions diverted from the COVID-19 purposes like testing supplies and the strategic national stockpile to house illegal immigrants at the southern border. All of it, frankly, Mr. Chairman, cries out for more oversight by this committee on the administration's COVID spending. Given that the White House is reportedly now asking for more funding to supposedly combat COVID-19, now more than ever, we ought to be holding a hearing on how the administration has spent or how they have misspent the trillions already handed to it. Particularly, Mr. Chairman, if we are going to take the time today to talk about how to loosen congressional oversight over spending, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include this letter we sent to you in the record for today's hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mulvaney, great to have you. As I'm sure you heard during your time as a member of Congress, whenever there is a discussion around raising the debt limit, our Democrat colleagues predict there will be catastrophic impacts accompanying a U.S. credit downgrade that they say will occur if the limit is not raised quickly and without debate. They are eager to cite the S&P downgrade of U.S. credit that occurred at the time of the 2011 debt limit debate, claiming that downgrade was a consequence of the debate and discussions that occurred. The premise being that negotiating about how to handle America's debt crisis, rather than just thoughtlessly lifting the debt limit, is itself a threat to our credit rating? Mr. Mulvaney, can you speak to the circumstances surrounding that decision by S&P at that time and what they said some of the reasoning was behind that decision?
Sure, Jason, because I was there in 11 during the showdown over the debt ceiling. I remember the S&P crisis, the S&P downgrade. I don't know how many members of this committee were here at that time, but yeah, it's always surprised me how that history has been revised. The history has been portrayed that it was because of the fight, because of the debt ceiling fight that we got the downgrade. That's actually not true. If you go and look at the S&P report, which I've got in front of me, I'll read sections to you. It says, we lowered our long-term rating on the U.S. because we believe that prolonged controversy over raising statutory debt ceiling and the related fiscal policy debate indicate that further near-term progress containing the growth in public spending, especially or in reaching an agreement on raising revenues, is less likely than we previously assumed. We also believe that the fiscal consolidation plan that Congress and the administration, so they downgraded us after the deal, the one they agreed to this week falls short of the amount we believe is necessary to stabilize the government debt burden by the middle of the decade. And we'll go on to say that our opinion is that elected officials remain wary of tackling the structural issues effectively address the rising U.S. public debt burden in a manner consistent with the AAA. Republicans and Democrats have only been able to agree to relatively modest savings on discretionary spending while delegating the select committee decisions on more comprehensive measures. It had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do with the compromise that came out. We got downgraded. The S&P knew that we didn't solve our problem. Did we kick the can down the road? Yes, and they were finally holding us to account over it. So I know that that's not the history that gets told in the press. I know it's not the history that gets told in politics. that the reason we got downgraded and could get downgraded again is not because we bicker over the debt ceiling. We always raise the debt ceiling. Everybody knows we're going to raise the debt ceiling. It's what we do. The question becomes, what do we do as part of raising the debt ceiling? Do we spend less or do we spend more? Keep in mind, and Mr. Hoyle will remember this, the Democrats only agreed to help us raise the debt ceiling in the Trump administration if we spent more money. So the leverage works both ways, depending upon who's in charge. So the debt ceiling, again, not the problem. Congress is the problem, and changing the debt ceiling isn't going to it'll probably just make them worse.
You know, Mr. Mulvaney, Congress is now facing another debt limit discussion within the next year or so, and perhaps sooner if more of the $7.5 trillion in new spending House Democrats have passed becomes law. As you know, the debt limit has often been paired with spending restraints or other long-term policies to rein in deficit spending, like you pointed out. But given that the 2011 S&P downgrade was a result of the markets having no confidence that Washington would curb its appetite to spend, and since we are facing a new debt limit crisis end of this year, when that next conversation over the debt limit occurs, what specific reforms do you think, Mick, that Congress should consider as part of any potential debt limit increase, apart from just abolishing the debt limit like Democrats are proposing? Should Congress consider bringing back caps on annual spending or other such policies that put into law real spending restraints?
Jason, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, my gut caps would be great, but keep in mind we did that in 2011, and then all Congress did every 2 years was raise the caps again. So even when we took those hard decisions in 2011 to do the Budget Control Act, we let ourselves out of that every 2 as we went forward, and as a result, again, I think it was Dr. Shiner who mentioned that the Budget Control Act didn't really have that much impact on the long-term debt, and she's right, but it really wasn't the fault of the Budget Control Act as much as it was of Congress relieving itself of those burdens. Look, we can go through a budget if you want to. I can't do it in 3 minutes, but if you want to start with places that I actually think there's a basis for compromise, was that we had really good discussions when I was in Congress about fixing some of the entitlements. Put Medicare aside for a second. It's really, really hard to do because it's a defined contribution, undefined benefit program. But Social Security is the type of thing that needs to be fixed and can be fixed. And when not politically easily, but it's mathematically easy. All of those programs are moving towards insolvency. By the time that ready to retire, so it probably doesn't affect him. But when you and I retire, Jason, I think we're looking at automatic across the board 20 or 25% security payments, unless Congress does something now. So yeah, as there's stuff that we could do to get our fiscal house in order, yes. But generally speaking, what you have to do is just going to spend money more wisely. You're going to spend less money when you can. And fiscal matters seriously. The debt ceiling gives you an excuse to get rid of it. I'm not sure when you're ever going to discuss deficits and debts anymore.
You know, Mick, you've put together budgets both as a House member and at OMB, and the gentleman from New York who spoke right before me tried to criticize the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And whenever you're looking at budgets, you have to pay attention to the revenues coming into the country. And I'd like to point out for the record that the tax revenues that came in last year was at 18%. That's the highest in 52 years. That follows President Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act. This year alone, we're right at 28% for this year. And that is under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed under this administration. So these higher revenues is how you put together a budget. But also something you do when putting together a budget is you calculate inflation. Given, Mick, that the inflation has proven not to be transitory, regardless of what Chairman Yarmouth says and what the Biden administration says, if you were at the OMB today, what sort of inflationary projection might you apply when drafting the president's fiscal year 23 budget?
Yeah, he mentions that inflation is transitory. I keep asking what that means because last time I checked, life is transitory, so it could be around forever. For my lifetime, and it would still technically be transitory. Everything is transitory. It's taxes. The inflation numbers are tough. I haven't gone back to look at the administration yet as to what their projections were for this year. For those of you who aren't familiar with this process, when you write well, of course,
They projected 2.1% for this year.
You
That's
have to
what the administration projected.
You have to project out for 10 years what you think the inflation numbers are going to do, and what they really need to do. I'd be curious to see. They owe us this week. Is a budget due out from the administration this week?
No, it was due last week. They're late again, but last year, of course, it was the latest budget in the history of America for any president.
Yep, and I'd be curious to see what their inflation projections are. Will it be 7% this year, then 6, and then 5, or will they go back to 2.1? Because when inflation at a real level of 5 or 6%, it drives deficits in a huge manner. Mr. Jeffries, I think was correct. I think that Donald Trump did set a record for the amount done in any 4-year term by any president, but I'd be willing to bet anybody in this committee that number is going to be blown away from the 4 years of the Biden administration.
I will just say, Mick, with the budget that was proposed last year of $68 trillion and all of the spending that Nancy Pelosi has done as Speaker of the House in the last 3 years, if you used all the taxes that have been collected since our country was founded, you couldn't even pay for all that spending. That's how unconscionable this spending is right now. Thank you, Mick, for being before our committee.
Jason.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now